Moving on to section 3, neural activity and hearing. So hearing pitch. Pitch, as you just learned, is the different perception of different frequencies of sound waves. And we also just talked about how different frequencies are coded in different parts of the basilar membrane, with higher frequencies being coded toward the base of the cochlea and lower frequencies being coded toward the apex of the cochlea. So each hair cell on the basilar membrane only responds to a range of frequencies. So they, kind of like how cones in the retina only respond to certain wavelengths of light. So if you remember from the visual system, some cones only respond to like red light or green light. They have specializations. Similarly, the sensory receptor cells of the auditory system, hair cells, only respond to a certain range of frequencies. And these frequency ranges are processed separately all the way through the primary auditory cortex, so all the way through the hindbrain and the midbrain, the thalamus, and to the auditory cortex. There's still separate areas of the auditory cortex for processing, the primary auditory cortex for processing different Hertz values. And they're kind of in order too. Cochlear implants work by stimulating areas of the basal membrane in the same way that sound waves would. So it literally is just trying to replicate what is happening in parts of the ear that are no longer working by stimulating those areas of the basilar membrane. So often hair cells in people who have acquired deafness, hair cells are damaged and they're no longer picking up on different frequencies, so cochlear implants can stimulate those areas of the basal membrane and sort of replicate what sound waves would normally do and hair cells would pick up on. In terms of detecting loudness, we talked before how loudness is the perception of intensity or the amplitude, the height of sound waves. Cochlear bipolar cells pick up or code for the intensity or amplitude of sound waves by firing at a greater rate. So the louder stimulus is, the bipolar cells are firing more quickly. We detect location in part from hearing, so we can tell from roughly what part of the environment around us the sound is coming from, and this is detected in a number of ways. One is the interaural time difference, which means the difference in time between when a sound hits, for example, the left ear versus the right ear. So if I have a sound stimulus on my right side, it's hitting my right ear first and then it's hitting my left ear. And it's a very small difference in time, but our brain can actually detect that and figure out that the sound is on my right side because of that difference. When a sound is on my right side, it's also going to be a little bit louder, and this is interaural intensity difference, the difference in loudness between the sound of the ears. And again, it's a very small difference, but our brain is very sensitive and can pick up on these differences and estimate that the sound is on the right side of my environment. Section 4, Anatomy of Language and Music. Music, it's always hard to tell looking retrospectively, but it appears that music may have evolved at the same time as language in the modern human brain. The same general areas of the brain in the left and the right are allocated to language and music, which indicates that these functions may have developed at the same time. There's a really famous flute artifact that was found in Slovenia in Europe that's estimated to be from around like 43,000 to 82,000 years old. And where it was found in Slovenia and also the time period suggests that it was made by Neanderthals. And fascinatingly, somebody who kind of like reconstructed the flute and found out that it played what is close to a major scale in our our Western European scales, but it actually was off one note, so one note was a little bit down, which makes it close to a jazz scale. So it might have actually been a jazz scale where the third of the scale is lowered. Might mean, and this is a lot of conjecture, but it might mean that Neanderthals were playing music that was something close to what we would think of as jazz intonations. Language structure appears to be innate to humans, and there's a number of reasons to believe this. This idea was first kind of propagated by this guy Noam Chomsky, and then a little bit later by this linguist Steven Pinker, who I believe are both still alive. Noam Chomsky's guy on the right, Steven Pinker is this kind of wacky looking dude with the curly hair. So one reason to believe that language structure is innate in humans is that in the 5,000 to 7,000 different languages that are in use by humans today, these languages all seem to be fundamentally very similar. So all of these languages have nouns, verbs, direct and indirect objects, despite the fact that many of them evolved quite separately from each other. Another reason to believe that language structure is innate to humans is that children are not actually explicitly taught how to speak, at least not typically. They just pick it up, and they pick it up very quickly. So we learned in a previous chapter that there are these sensitive periods of language acquisition, which is typically like 1 year to 6 years old, although children are learning things about language previous to 1 year. And the brain is primed to absorb this information and learn language during this time. We learned as well that if a child is not exposed to language during this time, during this very specific period of brain development, they are not typically able to develop, or pretty much not able to develop fluency in a language after that. Another reason to believe that language structure is innate to humans is the case of pidgin languages developing into Creole languages. So Pidgin is a simplified language that's created from 2 or more formal languages, so something like French and Spanish. It's like a hybrid simplified language that's created from these formal languages. And then Creole is a language that's developed from a Pidgin language that becomes formalized and then native to a group of people. So Creole languages are typically created when a Pidgin language is being spoken to a child within a given setting, and that sort of cohort of children who hear this Pidgin language develop this Creole language. And the children are not exposed, the children who are exposed to the Pidgin language are not exposed to formal language structures because it's this simplified language, but they create formal language structures in the same way that that we would have formal language structure in something like English. And so Hawaiian Pidgin is an example of this. Hawaiian Pidgin is actually a misnomer. Hawaiian Pidgin is a Creole language that was formed from an original Pidgin language influenced by Hawaiian, English, Cantonese, Portuguese, and other languages. And it's a formalized language now that was developed by the children of people who spoke the actual original Pidgin language. Language is localized in several areas of the brain, mostly in this parietal frontotemporal area. Many language functions are localized, but not all of them. So we're just going to talk about these specific areas that seem to be specialized to language. As we talked about before, for most individuals, particularly right-handed people and about 70% of left-handed people, language is lateralized in the left hemisphere. So we talked about Wernicke's area, which is associated with the interpretation of sound. Wernicke's aphasia is when there's a lesion to the Wernicke's area and the individual cannot comprehend or produce meaningful speech, but they can produce spoken words fluently. The words they produce are just meaningless. Just a reminder, aphasia means any sort of inability to produce or understand language. And then we talked about Broca's area, which is in the frontal lobe, and it's kind of in this frontal region, right in front of the motor cortex. It works alongside the part of the motor cortex that's responsible for facial motor functions. Broca's area appears to store the motor programs for words, so we're going to talk about motor programs a bit in the motor function section that's coming up in future weeks, but just generally any motor activity has sort of a program or a set of instructions, and language is no different. Different words require specific motor functions, and that is stored in Broca's area. As we learned in a previous chapter, Broca's aphasia is when an individual can understand speech but can't produce spoken words, and this results from a lesion or some other injury to Broca's area in the frontal lobe. There are additional areas that are, again, typically lateralized to the left hemisphere that are also associated with language functioning. The supplemental speech area, which is a speech production area in the left frontal dorsal cortex, and then these areas controlling facial movement or sensation in the motor cortex and somatosensory cortex. There's this interesting case study that I think your book brought up, where an individual had to have almost all of her left hemisphere removed, and in the process lost almost all of her language comprehension and production. I think she could produce like one sentence. However, she could still recognize songs and sing the words. She couldn't create new songs or learn new songs, and she couldn't understand the meaning of messages that were sung to her, but she still just remembered sort of the production of the words of these songs and could sing melodies, which is kind of an interesting case study, and is kind of a profound example of how music ability can be retained to some degree, even with a complete removal of the majority of the language areas in the brain.
The next two slides cover a recent pop culture phenomenon that's related to this chapter, and it's the infamous Yanny versus Laurel debate. So there was an audio file that appeared online that amazingly some people were certain said Laurel and some people were certain said Yanny. And it kind of created this debate between the Yanny hearers and the Laurel hearers. And of course, linguists and neuroscientists got right on it, and there were a couple articles published explaining the kind of the neurobiology and the cognitive science behind what was happening. So I think this image to the right is from an NPR article where a linguistic professor, Brad Story, kind of breaks down what was happening, why Laurel and Yanny sounded similar. So the first little image that you can see like these kind of three black blobs. And the first one is the actual audio recording that was interpreted as Yanny or Laurel. The second is the word Laurel spoken by Professor Story, and the third is Yanny spoken by Story. And you can see there's kind of a similarity in the dark sections of the words. So it's the same kind of blob shape in the black part of each of those audio files. And in the case of the original recording, the sound quality was so low that they created enough ambiguity that it could be interpreted as either Yanny or Laurel. So depending on maybe whether you're picking up the higher frequencies in the case of Yanny or the lower frequencies in the case of Laurel, you could interpret it either way. The New York Times created a tool where you can change the frequency of the original recording to hear either Yanny or Laurel, and it's very compelling. I highly recommend, if you haven't already played around with this, to try it out. So if you're a Yanny hearer and you change it to a lower frequency, you can hear it change slowly into Laurel, and if you're a Laurel hearer, you can change it to a higher frequency to hear Yanny. But of course, the original recording was either Laurel or Yanny, so it was Laurel. The original word was Laurel. I don't even think a Yanny is a word. And here's a link to the original NPR article from that first page if you're interested in reading more.
In processing music, the same general areas that are used in language processing in the left hemisphere are used for music processing in the right hemisphere, again, for most people. So if you look at this first row of brains, you can see the red areas are areas that are used in speech production and understanding speech, discriminating speech sounds. And then for similar functions in music, the same general areas are used for similar functions in music. So The area that discriminates speech sounds on the left hemisphere is used for comparing pitches in the right hemisphere. The one for listening to words in the left hemisphere is used for listening to melodies in the right hemisphere, etc. Just as language and the structure of language appears to be innate to humans, so does perceiving and creating music also appear to be innate to people. Our brains appear to be designed for this ability based on the number of areas that are designed for it. Amusia is an inability to differentiate musical notes. So this is, we might call more colloquially tone deafness. This affects about 4% of the population, and it's kind of analogous to aphasia. So aphasia is to language as amusia is to music. If you think you might be tone deaf, you might already know that, but if you want to find out, there's this test that takes maybe 5 minutes where it will tell you to what degree you may or may not be tone deaf. The kind of one of my favorite case studies in music processing is the case of Maurice Ravel, who is a French composer in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He was a composer and rather prolific during the majority of his life. He had, toward the end of his life, this degenerative medical condition. Your book mentions briefly that they mentioned it as a stroke, but this is actually, it's more likely that it was something like Alzheimer's or another type of dementia called frontotemporal dementia that affects the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. But regardless of what the condition was, it caused a progressive aphasia, so over time it created decreases in his language ability. His music perception was intact. He could still hear music and understand music, but his auditory memory and auditory imagery, so hearing music in his head, was still intact. But he couldn't read or write music, and he couldn't play the piano any longer. He was a composer, so playing the piano was a integral part of composing songs. Kind of in the process, so toward the end of his life, he composed this piece called Bolero, which is one of his best known pieces. If you like, you can follow the link either to a London Symphony Orchestra doing the first one, or a brass ensemble playing Bolero. And this piece is characterized by this unusually repetitive rhythm and melody. So even if you don't read music, you can see down at the bottom there's this rather simple rhythm, and it's repeated over and over and over again for this piece, which can be as long as 14 minutes. The same rhythm is being repeated on a drum. And similarly, there's this melody, which is just a couple bars long, that is also being repeated by different instruments and in different ways throughout this entire piece. People have looked back and believe that Bolero, the unusual repetitiveness of this piece, which is kind of why it's so well known, might have actually been due to the disorder, the degenerative disorder that Ravel was suffering from. So in Alzheimer's dementia and frontotemporal dementia, there's a symptom called perseveration, which is an obsessive repetition of actions or words. And they think that this repetitive rhythm and the repetitive melodies might have actually been a symptom of this degenerative disorder that Ravel was suffering from. Interestingly, there's this anecdote that's not clear if it's completely true or not, but people say that at the first performance of Bolero, a woman shouted out that Ravel was mad, and Ravel was said to have later stated that she must have truly understood the piece. Just kind of a cute anecdote about him. And then finally, music therapy. I know a number of you are interested in music therapy, and this is a growing field. It has been implicated by pretty preliminary research, but research nonetheless, that it can improve motor disorders, improving gait and arm training after stroke, can improve aphasia, so the ability can help with the ability to discriminate speech sounds, can help in mood disorders, improving and stabilizing mood. Autism spectrum disorders, it may improve communication, joint attention, or two people paying attention to the same thing, increasing social engagement by playing musical instruments together, and also just enhancing auditory processing, which can be dysfunctional in people with autism spectrum disorders. And then in pain, there's indication that people who experience especially chronic pain, there can be decreases in chronic pain with the use of music therapy. I'll probably send out a message about this later too, but if anyone's interested in music therapy, I have a contact of someone who is in music therapy in the field right now, and she would be happy to speak with anybody who's interested in music therapy.